Okay, we're going to have a little look at our strap connectors. So you have your two strap connector panels, and I'm going to pop a little glue. Why does glue always take so long to come to the end? I'm just going to pop a little glue, just a few spots sort of randomly on the wrong side of one piece. And then I'm going to very carefully position them wrong sides together, making sure all of the edges match. I'm using Fabri-Tac, so you've got a little bit of leeway. If they're not quite matched up perfectly, you can just smooth them about slightly. Sometimes it's easier, if you're not sure that you can cut accurately, to cut a bigger panel, stick them together, and then cut your shape from it. So you can cut your, I think it's 8x1 piece from the two pieces that so if you made a piece that was 9x1.5 and then two pieces that were 9x1.5 and stuck them together and then cut your 8x1 panel from it, you'd know that all of the edges would be perfectly matching. So just in case if you're not sure that you can get all of your edges perfectly matched, that's a good tip to do it. So that's my two pieces joined. So I now have the right sides on the outside, both sides. And I'm going to start in the middle, because that's the bit that you won't actually see on the finished strap connectors. Let's get my thread out. Excuse me. It's hay fever season now. You daren't cough in the current climate, because people run away when you cough. I'm going to top stitch all the way around the outside now. I tend to top stitch again at 1/8 of an inch. And I'm starting more or less in the middle, because that's where my stitches won't actually be seen on the finished items anyway. And I'm just going to top stitch around the outside. It's better to wait till your glue has dried. Now I'm using a Teflon foot on my machine. If you're not a Teflon foot person, then you can use a walking foot for sewing with faux leather, or even a roller foot will work sometimes. Or some machines have an inbuilt walking foot, like I think it's called an IDT, a walking foot system. I know a lot of the Genomes and Pfaff machines have a built-in walking foot system. Personally, I'm a Teflon foot girl. That's my foot of choice. And I don't buy Juki Teflon feet. I buy generic ones from eBay, which cost me all of about £4 or £5 a time. They don't last forever, and I've got quite a lot of them. I've got big ones, little ones, zipper foot, all sorts. None of them are generic, and none of them are Juki feet. They're all generic feet. This is a semi-industrial machine, or classed as a semi-industrial machine, but it's a high shank, the same as an industrial machine, and thus most industrial feet will fit it. I know there are purists who say you should only use Juki feet because you'll ruin your machine. Well, I've been sewing for 3 years on this machine with generic feet, no problem. So all the way around and back to the beginning where you started. Get rid of your stray thread. Where are my snips? Those scissors really do need to go somewhere else, because they're just not sharp enough. So I've now stitched all the way around, and I have a very long strap connector. Now these are raw edge. If your faux leather is very thin and stretchy, it's always worth popping between the two layers either a strip of ribbon, a strip of cordura, or something similar, something thin that just gives a little bit more strength to the faux leather. This is a nice strong faux leather, but some of them are thinner and stretchier, and a little bit of extra sort of strength inside will help. Now, these are raw edge, and for this is white, so actually the raw edge isn't too much of an issue. But if you want to cover the edges, you can use, and this takes a bit of a steady hand, you can use a Sharpie pen that will cover over the sides. Now, if you're using black faux leather or dark coloured faux leather that has a white backing, it looks quite nice if you just cover the edge. I use a Sharpie pen or permanent marker of some description, and it kind of gives a nice finish. Or you can use archival inks. So if you have an archival ink pad, you can dip the edges into an archival ink, because they are waterproof, so they won't run. Once they're on, they are permanent. I like with a Sharpie is that you can kind of put the point between the two layers, which will get right into that seam where you've stitched, and you won't have any bits showing. Or if you prefer, and this is not something that I've ever I discovered fairly recently, it was one of my testers for the Sigma, is a leather worker, and used leather edge paint on her Sigma wallet, and I thought, oh, that's genius. Didn't realise you could do that, so I purchased myself some tools for leather edge painting, and you can see that looks pretty cool on the side there. I mean, I've used black, which is probably not the best colour, but that's the way to show you what it looks like. It finishes it off okay. On this one, these ones, I've used leather edge paint, which gives a much nicer finish. It's difficult for you to see, I think, but you get a kind of a much more professional finish. And Jo from Country Cow Designs very kindly gave me her source for this, and basically what I've been using is, and don't get me wrong, I'm no expert here, this is not my field, I'm not a leather worker, but this does give a really nice edge to raw edge faux leather as well, is a foundation, is an edge foundation, which goes, it's quite a thick gloopy stuff, and it's you can buy it from the Identity store online in the UK. I'm sure you can buy the same sort of stuff in America and other countries, but I can only talk from what I can get from the UK. So this is the leather edge foundation, which you apply with, well, this is the tool I got. There are various little tools. This was an Amazon special. You kind of dip it in and then roll it along the edge of your where you want to put the leather edge paint. Now, I've got a system of hooks that I basically do this and then hang it up. It takes quite a while to dry, and I discovered that trying to go over it when it's not dry just makes an awful mess. So patience is definitely the name of the game. You need to do these 2 days before you start your bag if you're going to use leather edge paint. So I discovered fairly quickly that this stuff absorbs into the fabric that's behind your faux leather. So I put one coat on of the foundation, let it dry, and then put a second coat on, because I think the first coat seals it and the second coat then kind of fills the gap, if you like. Because this is porous, whereas leather isn't quite so porous, I think it sucks it in. So I put 2 coats of this on, and then I bought some, this is uber cheap, I think it was £2.99 a bottle, something like that, or I might have been 5 for a tenner, something like that. And I've got several different colours. Some of them I've had for yonks because I didn't know what, I bought some and I didn't know what to do with it. It's leather edge paint, and once you've got your foundation on, do exactly the same with this, and again leave it to dry. If it gets lumpy or gets quite gets a bit bumpy, you can use very, very fine sandpaper just to sandpaper it down, and then pop another coat on. So usually I do, what I've been doing is 2 coats of this, 1 to seal it and 1 to kind of fill the gap almost, and then 3 coats of this, but leaving a good amount of time in between. I discovered that using a hairdryer will dry this up quicker, so you don't have to leave it like all night, but ideally leave the whole thing overnight to dry off after the final coat. So as I say, I'm no expert on this. This was Jo from Country Cow Designs introduced me to this when she did the Sigma wallet, and she put some wonderful pink stuff around the outside, and I was like, oh, gotta have a go at that. So that's what I've been using, but say I'm no expert. I'm finding my way with it. So that's a leather edge paint. It does give a really nice finish. So I'm just going to pop that out of the way. So once you've got your strap connector and you've finished the edges, if you've done it with a Sharpie and you don't like the fact that it's matte, you can use a little tiny bit of Fray Check. Now again, I tried using Fray Check with something like this, but I've also tried using a cotton wool bud and just popping a little drop of Fray Check over it, which kind of seals it and gives it a slightly shiny finish, which actually looks really quite nice. So you know, those are different ways to finish the edges on a raw edge. So this is only a one to show you how to do it, because I've actually made my strap connectors well in advance because I did the leather edge paint. So once you've got your strap connector completed, fold it in half, cut it in half, then use just a little tiny bit of Fray Check on the top of those stitches to make sure they don't come undone if you're worried about them being secure. But you now have 2 strap connectors. I'm going to pop those out of the way because I have, it's a Blue Peter moment. I have strap connectors that I've made for this bag, and I've added a little tiny bit of weaving to them, which I'm not going to show you how to do. If you want to do it, figure it out yourself, you can do that. It's not difficult. So I'm going to take my bag and I am going to grab the ruler that I put over here, because we're going to make a mark that is 2 inches from the top edge on the outside, so along that side seam. So 2 inches. It's quite hard to see on this because this is a light coloured bag and my chalk is white, so my mark is made, but it's difficult to see. I'm going to take my strap connector and the raw edge where you cut, so you've got to figure out which is the top and the bottom. The bottom is the bit that's got the top stitching along the bottom. I'm going to lay my strap connector right sides together on that 2 inch mark that I've made. So the end that is the top stitched end is sticking out the top. So this is the bottom of your strap connector, if you like. So this is the top. And I'm going to use a couple of clips, and I'm using these long clips because I think these work perfectly for this, to hold it in place. Now the one thing I will say is open up the seam allowance inside of your bag when you do this. So I don't know if you can see, but the seam allowance is open inside of the bag. You should be able to see that. Yeah, you can. And what we're going to do is we are going to stitch along the bottom of our strap connector at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we're only going to stitch the strap connector. We're not making our stitches coming off either side. We're going to stitch at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you do have to manipulate this. I have a flatbed machine, not a free arm machine. It's a lot easier than a free arm machine. And you're going to stitch across the bottom at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, making sure that that seam inside stays open as you go. Make sure you don't stitch on the other side of your bag as well as you go. Again, see, my machine is a flatbed machine, so it's a little more difficult for me. So I've done that. I've backstitched a little at the beginning and the end, and then I'm going to do another line of stitching that is 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So we'll have 2 lines of stitching. Back stitch 1 or 2 at the beginning, So now you can see let me just get rid of the threads because, oh, I hate threads. And I'm not taking the clips off, but you can see I've done, my first line of stitching is at 1/8 of an inch, my second line of stitching is at 1/4 of an inch from this raw edge. The raw edge will be covered, so don't worry, you're not going to see it. You can remove your clips, and you can see that inside my seam allowance is now stitched open. If you want to stitch that top bit open, you can do, just to hold it in place, but it's not a big drama, right? It will stay open more or less on its own now because it's been stitched at that point. So at this point, we take our bag hardware. Now I've already made a tassel and attached it to it because I find it a lot easier to attach a tassel before I start making the bag than I do after I've made the bag. I'm going to thread my strap connector onto my hardware onto my strap connector. Now if you've got a rectangle that is curved, and this one is curved, it's not, let me just try and, it's got a slight curve to it, it's not completely flat. Make sure that your curve is towards the bag rather than the other way around. It will look odd otherwise. Bend your strap connector over. Let's just get my tassel out of the way. And now you have two choices. You can either stitch across here or stitch down either side, or you can pop a rivet through, or two rivets. Really is up to you how you do this. I'm just going to pop my other one on before I go any further. So I'm just going to pop a clip to hold that in place. So you're bending your hardware, you're bending your strap connector down. Now I'm not giving you any measurements for where you put your rivet or put your stitching, because it will really depend on how thick your hardware is. I mean, I push the hardware down as far as it will go and then bend the strap down. But if you've got really thick hardware, you're going to have more of a lump there with the hardware in. This is quite thin, so it's not too bad. I can't give you measurements because it will depend on how thick your hardware is. But if you put it down, you don't want to be trying to put your rivet through this layer and the layer that's underneath. You want your rivets to go through the bag body and the strap connector, if that's what you're going to do. Tassel's in the way really, isn't it? Hey ho. So I'm now going to do exactly the same thing on the other side. So I'm going to make a 2-inch mark on the exterior of my bag. On the seam, let's just hold that. In place. I'm going to take my strap connector and I'm going to lay it right sides together with the bottom end of the strap connector facing upwards. So it's facing outside, it's sitting outside of the bag. I'm going to open the seam inside. I'm going to take another couple of long clips, which will hold that seam open inside. And again, I'm going to manipulate my bag to do my stitching along the bottom. So if you have a free arm, this is a lot easier. I do actually have a machine with a free arm, but I wanted to show you that it is possible on a flatbed machine, because it really is. So you can see I'm flattening out the bag and I'm just going to stitch. Let's just make sure the seam allowance is open. It is. Stitch across. At with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then again at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Let's get rid of my threads. Get rid of the threads inside as well, because these things breed in bags, we all know that. And again, there you can see strap connectors all fitted, 2 lines of stitching, and inside my seam allowance is open. And I can put my second rectangle on. Push it down as far as it'll go, and then pull the clips vanishing. So you can see there we have our strap connector. Now if you're going to do rivets, don't do one single one through the middle, because if you do, you'll be cutting through the stitching on your side seam, and that will just weaken your bag. You need to put 2 rivets, one on either side of the side seam. Now I think on this occasion I'm going to stitch this, because I just fancy a stitched one. I want to go for the minimum amount of hardware. So with this in mind, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a little mark where I want to stitch, and I want to stitch just below where that piece underneath is. So I'm going to just pop a little, I don't know why I'm doing this because I can't actually see it very well, but it just gives me, oh no, I can actually, it's not as bad as I thought. So I'm just going to manipulate the bag underneath the needle again. Make sure that your strap connector is sitting perfectly straight down your side seam. So flattening out the bag. And make sure the side seam is open inside. And I'm just going to stitch across . And for security, I'm going to do 2 lines of stitching, because 1 line of stitching to hold the entire strap connector on seems a little bit mean. Oops, my thread's now come out, so I just need to pull my thread through the machine. And I'm doing my stitching approximately 1/8 of an inch apart, doing just 1 back stitch at the beginning and the end. This is one of the instances where I don't bury my threads. I like to just do 1 back stitch just to secure that. Raise my needle so I don't scratch my faux leather as I pull it out. Get rid of my stray ones. And there we have 1 strap connector. And so I like the look without the rivets. I think it gives a nice minimal look. But if you want to put rivets through, a couple of rivets, 1 either side. You could even put a couple of rivets at the bottom if you wanted to, if you don't want your strap connector to be free like this, if you have a worry that it will curl up. I've never had one curl up, but they tend to sit quite nicely. But if you wanted to put a couple of rivets at the bottom, I think one of my testers did a couple of rivets at the bottom. Don't quote me on that though, because it's been a while. Your strap connector's pretty cool. Looks pretty cool. So I'm going to do exactly the same on the other side, trying not to stitch over this tassel that I put on. So So I am gonna eyeball this one. I'm not gonna make a mark because actually once I'd got the thing down, I couldn't see the mark. Hadn't actually considered that idea when I was picking faux leathers for this one. So let's get it manipulated under the needle. Let's get that tassel out of the way. Let's make sure my strap connector is nicely central with my side seam, and just below where the 2 layers are. Make sure I'm not stitching over the other side. First line done. Second line done. Raise my needle and pull that out from underneath. Get rid of any stray threads. And there we are. You can see the strap connector sits nicely down the side seam. I've got a tassel on there, but that's neither here nor there. And both lines of both my stitching inside and outside keep that seam allowance open. So there we have strap connectors fitted. If you chose to use a different strap connector, that's fine. I know one of the testers used the Emmeline diamond shaped connectors, which looked really cool. You could use, actually you could probably use the long johns down the side here, but I'm not sure how they fit. I think the depending on where you buy them, I think the connecting parts for the long johns is actually central, so that might not work because you don't want to be going through the seam. But certainly the diamond connectors work very nicely for this if you don't want to do these sort of strap connectors, but I just think that's a bit different. So that's the outside of our bag done, the base done, and our strap connectors. So we'll come back and have a look at our zipper panel. There are 2 different methods for the zipper panel, depending on whether you're doing faux leather or you're doing fabric. So I will show you both. Other than the zipper panel, the rest of the construction for this bag is entirely the same, whether you're using fabric or faux leather. There are only a couple of differences on the zipper panel, which I'll show you both options regardless of which you're planning to do. You can actually, if you wanted to, you could use fabric for the zipper panel and faux leather for the exterior. You could use faux leather, fabric for the exterior and faux leather for the zipper panel. The combinations are absolutely endless and absolutely your choice. So there we go, and we'll come back with the next part very shortly.